Hey there, seventh graders. This is Mr. Garnett Cook, creating this screencast as an introduction to our new unit on ancient Greece. Now that we're going to be out for the better part of the next couple of months, it's going to be important to move on. And so we're going to be introducing, starting this week, a unit on ancient Greece. So what I'm going to be doing is giving you a short introduction, followed by explaining to you some of the things you're going to be doing next week, or we'll have the option of doing next week. Anyway, we're going to be starting a unit on ancient Greece. I want to begin with these images that you see on the screen right here. I want to direct your attention first to the image on the left, the topographical map of Greece. And one of the things that I want to point out to you, just a couple of things that will be fleshed out more when we talk about the geography in more detail. But this area here is mainland Greece. You can see me circling here with my cursor. And then down here, this area here is what is known as the Peloponnesus. And then down here is the island of Crete. And this sea in here is what is known as the Aegean Sea, and all the Greek islands are in the middle of that. And on the other side of the Aegean here, you see the western coast of modern-day Turkey. One of the things that I want to direct your attention to, just in terms of the topography of mainland Greece and the Peloponnesus here, is just how mountainous it is. Unlike other places we've learned about this year, Greece is not a river valley civilization. And as we'll get into a little bit more, the earliest towns and cities in Greece developed in relative isolation from one another because of how imposing, how rugged and mountainous the landscape was. That's something that we'll talk about a little bit more at another time. Over here is a picture of Athens at night, and one of the most distinctive features of Athens is the Acropolis. And so this is the Acropolis overlooking the city of Athens. And this building here is what is known as the Parthenon. The Athenian Acropolis is the most famous Acropolis in Greece, but there are other cities that had similar kinds of things. They're basically fortifications high up on a hill that also had structures such as temples built on them. The word Acropolis actually comes from two Greek words, the word acro, which means high up or high, and then the word polis, which is another word we'll come back to, which means city. So Acropolis literally means high over the city. Down here is an artist's rendering of a famous figure in Greek literature, Achilles, who is one of the heroes of Homer's epics, the one most famous one being the Iliad. I'll probably say a little bit more about that in future screencasts about Achilles and about the Iliad and the companion epic poem written by Homer known as the Odyssey. I want to talk just for a couple minutes about why the Greeks matter. As you're studying the Greeks, just want to point out a couple of things about the Greeks that make them significant to us even today. And so I'm just going to point out a couple of things for you. And one of them is the first history writing comes from Greece. We've mentioned a couple of times in class this year a Greek historian named Herodotus. You may remember I mentioned his name when we were learning about mummification, because a lot of the detail about how mummification happens is detail we got from the writing of Herodotus. And the Greeks were the first people to really be concerned with the idea of writing accurate history, not just writing tales or stories or legends or mythologies, but actually trying to write an accurate version of the history of their own people. So the first history writing comes from the Greeks. From the Greeks, we get the concept of what we call today democracy, the idea that people have power. And we'll come back to the meaning of the word democracy in a couple of weeks. It's somewhat ironic because Greece, and particularly Athens, is credited with being the birthplace of democracy, and yet, as we'll learn, Athens itself was, by modern standards, hardly democratic, but that's something we will come back to. We also get from the Greeks the idea of something we'll be discussing more in 8th grade, the concept of citizenship. Is from the Greeks, we get the birth of this idea that ordinary people were people who had political power. Most of the civilizations we learned about this year were places where people were simply subjects of their emperor, of their king, of their pharaoh. They had few rights and they had little to no political power at all. The Greeks really popularized the idea of people having power and people being able to participate actively in the political life of their city. And that's something we will also come back to. We also have Greek philosophy, people like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates being the most famous, whose ideas and the things they wrote about really have shaped a lot of our modern day thinking about a lot of things: politics, science, religion, what it means to be a good citizen, how people should be educated. A lot of different ideas that still have force today come from the Greeks. The other significant thing is that Greek was the dominant language of the ancient Mediterranean world. When the Greeks reached their zenith of power, it was such that no matter where you traveled in the Mediterranean world, yes, there were a lot of regional languages, but the common sort of universal language for the longest time was Greek. In fact, there are some who have suggested that even when the Roman Empire came to power, more people within the Roman Empire spoke Greek than actually spoke Latin, which is the language most commonly associated with the Romans. And so Greek was kind of the universal language of certainly the ancient Mediterranean world. Then you also have the influence of Greek art, theater, literature, science, math, architecture. The Greeks would have influence in all of those areas hundreds, frankly, thousands, a couple thousand years after the height of Greek culture. Right into the 19th century. Think about our U.S. Capitol, for example, Washington, D.C. A number of buildings that are built there were built during a period of architecture in America called the Greek Revival period. And so modeling great architecture after Greek influences. Here's a map of the Mediterranean, and just a couple of things that I want to point out to you, and this is worth actually activating my little pen function here. In terms of thinking about sort of where we have been studying this year, the Greek mainland is right here, really in the heart of the Mediterranean Sea. And so one of the things that's important to point out is that as the Mediterranean world was growing, say between 800 BCE and maybe the first century of the Common Era, the Greeks found themselves smack in the middle of it. And when we learn about Rome toward the end of the year, there is Italy, also really smack in the middle of the Mediterranean world, as compared to Egypt, which is down here, and Mesopotamia, which is way over here. You had really Greek world evolving at a time when to be centrally located in the Mediterranean was becoming increasingly more valuable and more important. And we'll say a little bit more about the significance of that geography over the next couple of weeks. You're going to be learning over the next few weeks about three major periods in the history of ancient Greece. And I want to give you a brief overview of each one. And one of your assignments that you can do for this week, which is going to be a history of Greece, we'll dive into these periods in a little bit more detail. The first period is what is the period of the earliest civilizations of Greece, from approximately 2600 to approximately 1100 BCE. The two peoples who are most associated with this period are people known as the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. They were both early Greek civilizations, and especially the Mycenaeans, that really dominated the Greek mainland. Both, at a certain point, kind of disappeared. There's a pretty good understanding of what happened to the Minoans, and we'll talk about that. But what happened to the Mycenaeans remains a historical mystery to this very day. I will get into, in a future screencast, some of the theories behind what happened to the Mycenaean people. But around 1100 BCE, the Mycenaeans kind of disappear from the archaeological record. And there is an interesting question as to why. It's from these early periods that we get the origins of the stories written by the famous Greek writer named Homer. Homer's two epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are believed to have been modeled after people who lived during the Mycenaean period. The Archaic period in Greece, and we'll get into a little bit of this period as well, 800 to 480 BCE. This is where we see the rise of what are known as the Greek city-states, Athens and Sparta being the most famous. And each city-state is his own independent city with its own independent government. Greek city-states, particularly during this period, were very much isolated from one another, very limited contact, And they only had a couple of things really in common. They spoke the same language and they worshiped the same gods. Those are the big things that the city-states have in common. Other than that, they're in many ways very different places. We also see during this period the expansion of trade, Greek trade networks that will extend farther and farther across the Mediterranean, east and west. The Archaic period ends with the first of the two really epic conflicts in the history of ancient Greece that we'll touch upon. It was the Persian Wars. The Persian Empire tried to unsuccessfully invade and conquer the Greeks starting around 480 BCE. And then you have what is called the classical period. And the classical period in Greece is the period about which people usually know the most. This is when a lot of Greek art and literature and philosophy really began to flourish. This is also the time period of the Peloponnesian War, which is the other conflict we'll learn about. This was a conflict between the ancient Greek city-state of Athens and the city-state of Sparta and the allies on either side. This conflict will really hasten the beginning of the end of the Greek city-states. And it will pave the way eventually for the rise of people to the north of the Greek mainland, people known as the Macedonians, and arguably the most famous person in the study of ancient Greece, Alexander the Great. And we will end our study of ancient Greece by learning about Alexander and his impact, not just on Greece itself, but really on the Mediterranean world, because it's going to be Alexander's empire that will be responsible for the spread of Greek influence all over the Mediterranean. And we will come back and learn a little bit more about that in the next couple of weeks. So that's kind of a broad introduction to ancient Greece. We'll be saying more in future screencasts. One of your homework assignments this week is a history of ancient Greece. And so you'll be reading that. Just follow the directions on that. The other assignment is going to be connected to Greek vocabulary. A lot of specific terms that are really specific to the study of Greece will be part of that. So look for those assignments starting on Monday. And I'll have more to say next week. If you have questions for me, don't hesitate to shoot me a question through Canvas email, and I will answer it as quickly as I can. And if necessary, I will address it in an announcement on Canvas. So I hope you're all doing well, and I hope you do well with the assignments. And again, don't hesitate to write to me if you have questions.